Hi, my name is Brett, and this is episode 7 of Test-Driven RSpec. This is the last episode of the series where we've been going over TDD with RSpec. We're going to cover viewing and adding records using the web interface, all driven out through Capybara feature tests. We're going to start by creating our feature spec. In spec features directory, we're calling it console-spec.rb. Require the Rails helper because this is a full stack Rails test. We're going to do RSpec.describe. We're going to pass in the name of this test, which is just console's features to describe it. And our first one is going to be describe viewing the index. And when you view the index, it will list all of the consoles. Save that. I'm going to just run it really quick, make sure I didn't have any typos or issues to get this TDD cycle started. Great, it's working. Now when creating feature specs that interact with the database and records, I tend to think about it in 3 steps, and those 3 steps can be expanded upon as needed based upon the complexity of the feature you're testing. The first step is to create your test data. This might be your user record that you go and log in with and then interact with the app with. In our case, we're going to create some consoles and then we'll expect certain things to happen with those consoles. 2 is you interact with the app. That might be clicking, that might be submitting a form. And then 3, you're going to expect something to happen. That might be a flash message to be displayed, new text to be displayed, a new button to appear. Whatever the goal of this it is, and we're going to say it lists all the consoles. So we're going to start by creating a console. I use create with an exclamation mark to make sure that when it gets created, it fails if I have a typo in the creation, like if it's not valid, because I don't want that to fail silently. We're going to create 2 records to start, and we'll stick with Nintendo and Nintendo Switch because I've been using that in the last episode, in previous episodes. Name of Switch, and then we'll do Wii. We'll interact with the app. I usually start that interaction by visiting the root route and then navigating to where we're going to go using the actual application instead of visiting a specific URL. We're going to click a link with the name of consoles, because you can imagine an upper nav in the application where you could click consoles and then view all the consoles. And we're going to expect the page to have the content of Nintendo Switch, and we're going to expect the page to have the content of Nintendo Wii. Now, what we're testing here could be covered. You could create this code very easily with Rails generators, but I think by covering simple CRUD features like this, you'll get a sense of the process without it being too specific in one domain or one application, and hopefully you can take this and then apply it to your own tests. This failed because there's no link consoles in the app yet. So if we go to our view application, our views layout application, we only are rendering the text from each view, where I want to add a navigation element that includes a link to consoles, and it'll go to the console's path. Save that, run the test again. It fails because there's no method called console's path. This, similar to previous episodes, has to do with our routes. We don't have a console's route that's not API namespace. So I'll pull that up because it's very similar, but we want this for the actual web view. We have a failure of uninitialized constant consoles controller. Again, this is second nature by now. We need our controller. So I'll create that controller file. It'll be a class called consoles controller that inherits from application controller. If I can type, we'll get it. Create that, save, run it again. It fails this time because there's no index action. Add the index action, save it, run it again. Get a new failure, which is great, and we're missing the view for that. Do make dir, need app views, this will be consoles. Create that file, index.html.erb, save it. I'm going to add an h1 of consoles just because it makes it clear where we are in the app. Run the test again. Might seem a little tedious at first, but once you get in this groove of making a change, running it, making a change, running it, it feels really great when you get in the groove. And here we have our first real failure of expected to find text Nintendo Switch in the text string consoles. It might be confusing as to what consoles is, and what it is expect the page to have content. The content of the page that it's checking the expectation against is just the plain text from whatever it grabs from the page. It doesn't include the HTML code, it doesn't include any classes, things like that. It's just the text. And we have that consoles link that we added in the nav, and then I just added that h1 of consoles. So that's why there's two consoles. And this failure is good because it's saying we want Nintendo Switch, but it's not there. That's because we haven't written the code to actually render it. So we're going to loop through our consoles. We're going to say each do console. Got to get the syntax right. There we go. And we're going to say console.formatted name, which is a method from previous episode. I'm going to move them into a list because I think that is a nice way to render them. You could also do a table, but we'll stick with the list for now. Save that, run it again. We get a failure of undefined method each for nil class. And that's because this each method is trying to be called on consoles, which again needs to be plural, sorry about that. It doesn't exist, and that will need to get assigned in our index. So we'll assign our consoles here, and that would be console.all. Pretty standard Rails code so far, just to render it all out. Make that change, save it, run it again, and look, we have our first passing test in the episode of viewing the index of consoles. At this point, it's really nice to go and open up your Rails app just to make sure it's working. You might have your server running at the same time, so you don't have to start it up like I did, but we'll go to the home page just like our test, click consoles just like the test, and we'll see some consoles that I added to the app. And they're being listed. Great. I think that is a nice test to start and a good feature. Next, we're going to add the ability to add a new console through a form in the web app. Similar to how we started before, we're going to describe this by saying describe adding a new console. And we're going to say it adds the console to the list of consoles. That might be a little redundant, the of consoles, but let's just stick with it. We'll go with our 1, 2, 3 setup. Except in this time, since we're creating the data ourselves, we're not going to use console.create like the model, using the model with the active record method. Instead, we're going to interact with the app, and through the interactions with the app, create our data. So visit / the root path, click the link of consoles, and then we're going to click a link called add new console. Then what we're going to do is we're going to actually interact with the form. So we're going to say fill in name with, we'll call this one Vita. We'll call it PlayStation Vita, and the manufacturer will be Sony. So it'll be Sony PlayStation Vita. Then we're going to click a button with the name, with the text of it that says create, and then we're going to do some expectations based upon what we expect to now happen. So we're going to say expect the page to have content of Sony PlayStation Vita. We're also going to expect the page, the current path, which is a Capybara method that's available that returns like /console or whatever the path of the current page is. And we're going to expect the user to go back to /consoles. And I like testing this sometimes when the user is changing pages. And once they submit this form, we expect them to be redirected to /consoles. So I'd like to test that and make sure that's happening. We could also here, since we're interacting with this new form, we could expect the current path here to be console/new. The other test we added originally of lists all the consoles pass. Sorry, I noticed a typo here. I'm just going to fix it really quick. It lists all the consoles. That passes. Now we have our red failure of unable to find visible link of add new console. We need to actually add that link here of link to the text of add new console. And that'll link to the new console path. Save it, run it again. We get a new failure, undefined local method or variable, new console path. We need to go into our routes file and make that new console path. Up until this episode, I've been using the HTTP verbs of get and also this root method because I just want it to be as straightforward as possible as to what we're adding. In a lot of Rails apps and in a lot of cases, you're going to use the resources method with the symbol of the plural model you're accessing. And this resources method will create the get for the index. It'll create the get for the show. It'll create the get for the new. It'll create the post for the create. It'll create all of the routes you need with one handy method. If you ever wanted to see what it creates, you can do bin rake routes, and that'll actually output all of the routes that are created. So here you'll see new console. What you have here, we have consoles path, and that way you have these prefixes too. So you have consoles path, new console path, edit console path. Bin rake routes is a nice way to just see your routes. So we're all set there. We'll run our tests again. See why it fails now. It says action new cannot be found for consoles controller. Straightforward enough. Add new, save it. Failure this time, similar to last time, is we don't have our views, so we do app views consoles new.html.erb, and I'm just going to add a little title of new console form just to be explicit as to what this page is. Save it, run it again. Unable to find visible field name that is not disabled. We have our failure for our first failure for an expectation we wrote. That's because we need to do form for a new console. So we'll do console.new. You could assign that console.new to a variable in your controller, and we'll tweak that in a minute. We'll leave it right there for now. We'll do form for console.new. It'll be the block parameter of f. We'll end it and close the block, save it, and we want to add a label of name, which is what the Capybara spec is using. The RSpec, the method fill-in is using from Capybara, and our spec is using name, which it expects to be a label, and we're going to do f.textField of name, because that's the one we are looking for. Close that label. If you nest your field within a label, if you click the label, it then highlights this, which is a nifty little HTML trick. Save it, run the test again, and we have an issue here, which it catches right away, which is nice. I type form, but we want form 4. We have our next failure related to manufacturer, so we're good with the name. Copy and paste that, tweak it to be manufacturer. There we go. Unable to find visible button, create. Now we just need to add the button for the field, or for the form, excuse me. That'll be fSubmit, which takes a parameter of what you want the button text to be. Now we have a new failure of action create could not be found. So the form's being submitted, and it's trying to create the record, but doesn't have the action, the controller action to do so. Now, since we're not doing anything in create, like redirecting or rendering a template, it says unable to find visible path xpath/html. And that's because we're going to want to redirect to the console's path, right? So after we create the record, which we haven't done yet, but after you create it, we're going to redirect to the console's path, back to the list of them. We have a different test failure now of expected to find the text Sony PlayStation Vita in the list of consoles, but it's not there. That means we need to do console.new. This will be something like the params for the console, do console.save. I think that could just be console.save without the exclamation mark. Normally in your controller tests, you do a branching path of, you've probably seen this before, if console.save, redirect to else, render new or whatever the actual code is. But for this case, we're just going to keep it nice and simple and just create it and save it. I forgot to assign the variable. Let me run that again. See what the failure is here. It says Activemodel forbidden attributes error. If you've never seen that before, it has to do with strong params, which makes it explicit which parameters you want to be passed in when you're creating records, because you don't want to let any parameter get passed in because it could be a potential security vulnerability. So you explicitly declare which ones are allowed. What you do through, you create a private method we'll call this console params. Make it private because it's not an actual action that's being used. Create the method. And that looks like params.require. We're requiring the top level console and we're permitting name and manufacturer. Run it again, hey, and it passes. So we have a form that's creating new consoles, and then it's displaying it in that list. At this point, I want to actually show the application and test it myself to make sure it's working. Sorry, that Tilda messed it up. I'll open the app, we'll refresh our consoles page. Now we have this new button of add new console. Let's add a new console, we'll add PS3, and we'll call it Sony. Create it, now it's in our list. Let's add another one, we'll do my favorite console, which is the 3DS. Nintendo, hit create again. Now we have 3DS being displayed. This is really simple and trivial, but I think it illustrates writing feature specs. Now we've done the test-driven development of adding the features, right? We had red tests, we made them pass, they're green, and now we can refactor. That's where you get that saying of red, green, refactor. And we'll do the refactoring step. A few things that come to mind for me right now are this console.new. Let's actually make that a variable of console. Pull this out into our controller. And then here in new, we're going to assign console to be console.new. I think it just follows the other paradigms and goes along with this assigning of the variable and using it there. Run the tests again. Make sure it's still passing. Great, it's green, it's still passing. Is there anything else we want to change? I don't think so. I think that's looking good to me right now. I'd say the only other thing I do now is just run the whole test suite. So when you make a small change and you get it passing, that's great. Then you want to run your whole test suite and make sure that those changes you made didn't break anything else within the app. As we see there, those tests are passing. We have the index test, we have the new tests. They test the various things we wanted to test. And I actually just saw one thing, that's why I paused for a second, that we can actually refactor here. In this test, I see two things that are duplicated. This visiting and the clicking of the link of the consoles. So what we can do is we can create a let method called view consoles. And we can reuse that code. We'll make 2 lines 1 because why not? So instead of visit slash, we'll do visit and click link consoles. Here we can just do view consoles. I'm going to remove these comments just for the sake of cleaning up the code. We can do view consoles. Let's run the test again, just the individual run. It passes still, which is cool. So you can pull these into let's here, and let's say we wanted to use view consoles or something like login throughout your app. We could create a helper called like consoles helper or authentication helper and put that in a module similar to we did in the previous episode of inspect support of request helpers. We could actually move it here too, but instead of request helpers, right, we would make it called feature helpers or consoles helper and pull that out. I won't do that again because we covered that in a previous episode, but These kind of feature specs, these kind of like common interactions with the app to get you to a certain place are a great candidate for that kind of extraction into a module. And this covers episode 7, and it wraps up the whole series. I hope this was helpful. I really wanted this series to be a straightforward introduction to doing test-driven development with RSpec with Rails to cover that pattern of approach and the mindset, and give you some of the basics to get you started on writing your own tests. I'd like to do a more advanced RSpec series in the future, so if there's anything that you would like to see covered or any questions you have, let me know and I'd be happy to add them to the list of episodes. Thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it. Have a good one.